They came for gold. They found hell. In 1849, a group of pioneers seeking a shortcut to California took a wrong turn into Death Valley. What followed was weeks of starvation, dehydration, and death, and a goodbye that gave the valley its name. The California gold rush had turned the West into a fever dream. By the end of 1849, over 80,000 people had crossed the continent in search of fortune. The path was grueling, but the promise of gold was stronger than fear. Wagon trains stretched for miles. Families risked everything. Among them was a group of about 100 emigrants, mostly families, who joined what they believed was a safer, shorter route to California. The main party followed the known trail across the Sierra Nevada. But this smaller group had heard of a new cutoff, a supposed shortcut promoted by a guidebook written by a man who had never traveled it himself. The group, known today as the Bennett Arcane Party, splintered off at Salt Lake City, Utah, and began following the so-called Hastings Cutoff, the same path that had doomed the Donner Party just 3 years earlier. They soon found themselves in a vast, unfamiliar wasteland. As they moved westward, the shortcut turned into a trap. By November, the party had entered the edge of a massive desert basin, what we now call Death Valley. They had no accurate maps. Water sources were almost non-existent. Wagons began to break down in the rocky passes. Animals weakened. Children cried for water that didn't exist. They didn't know it yet, but they were about to be stranded in one of the hottest, most desolate places on Earth. By the time they reached the valley floor, it was too late to turn back. The terrain was alien, jagged rock, alkaline flats, and sand as fine as flour. The heat was unbearable during the day, and the cold sliced through them at night. The oxen died first, then the horses. Wagons were stripped for firewood and abandoned. They ate rawhide and boiled animal bones. They tried chewing on cacti and sucking dew from rocks. Some filled canteens with muddy runoff that made them sick. They argued, they wept, they prayed. Realizing that their only hope was to find help, 2 men, William Lewis Manley and John Rogers, volunteered to strike out across the desert. They carried little more than a rifle, some scraps of food, and a determination not to die in the sand. They hiked west through canyons and over mountain ranges, surviving on snowmelt and roots, navigating by starlight, until, miraculously, they reached the San Fernando Valley. There they convinced locals to give them supplies and pack animals, and then they did the unthinkable. They turned around and went back into Death Valley. They found the surviving families huddled in makeshift shelters, some too weak to walk. Others had died and been buried in shallow graves, their markers made from scrap wood and stones. Manley and Rogers gathered the survivors and led them, step by agonizing step, out of the valley and into the Panamint Mountains. Even then, the final crossing nearly killed them. Somewhere along the trail, as the last survivors looked back from the ridgeline, one woman is said to have whispered, "Goodbye, Death Valley." And with those words, the land was named. Of the original party, many had perished, some by exposure, some by disease, some by despair. But others made it, thanks to the heroism of 2 men who refused to abandon the lost. In time, William Manley published a book chronicling the journey, titled Death Valley in '49. His account became a warning and a legend, a cautionary tale about trusting shortcuts and the deadly arrogance of maps drawn by fools. The route the 49ers followed would never again be used by wagon trains, but their suffering became woven into the myth of the American frontier. The bones of their animals still rest beneath the sand. The rusted rims of wagon wheels poke out from dry creek beds, and their footprints, though erased by wind and time, still echo through the canyons. They had set out in search of gold. What they found was something far crueler, the price of ambition in a land that owed them nothing. Thank you for listening to Deserted Trails. If this story moved you, consider joining us again as we uncover more forgotten truths from the American frontier.